Home entertainment. A constantly changing environment. Things have come and gone, but one thing that has stayed consistent over the years is video games. Despite things like VHS, DVDs, and record players that were once at the top of their game fading out and becoming more niche over the years, consoles have evolved and maintained their holds on society, but not all survived. Arcades first started out in the late 1800s and included simple coin-operated machines, such as strength testers, fortune tellers, and early mechanical games. As time went on and we reached the 1930s, we started having things such as amusement arcades, which included machines such as pinball machines. Then we reached the golden era of arcades, which would be the late 70s to the mid 80s, and included actual video games such as Space Invaders, Pac-Man, and Donkey Kong. The first generation of video game consoles began in the early 1970s, officially launching the home gaming industry. The Magnavox Odyssey became the first commercially released home video game console in 1972. Instead of using cartridges in the way later consoles would, the Odyssey used plug-in circuit cards. These cards didn't actually store game data, but instead changed how the console functioned internally. Players could also place plastic screen overlays directly onto their television screens to create the illusion of more detailed graphics. The Odyssey featured simple games such as hockey, tennis, and basic chase games. Also in 1972, Pong was released in arcades by Atari and quickly became a massive success. Its popularity sparked what is now known as the Pong explosion. By 1975, Atari brought Pong into the home with the release of the Atari Home Pong, allowing families to play a version of the hit arcade game in their living rooms. Soon after, competitors flooded the market. In 1976, companies like Coleco entered the scene with systems such as the Coleco Telstar series, which offered multiple Pong variations and expanded features. These early consoles were extremely limited compared to anything that came later. Most systems had games built directly into the hardware, meaning players couldn't swap games in and out. Visually, games were very simple. Graphics were usually made up of dots, lines, and small blocks of light on the screen. Audio was either extremely basic or completely non-existent, so gameplay had to carry the entire experience. As a result, many first-generation systems offered multiple variations of essentially the same concept, usually some form of paddle and ball gameplay similar to table tennis. As competition increased between 1975 and 1977, manufacturers started adding more game modes, multiplayer options, and adjustable difficulty settings to attract buyers. Pricing also became more competitive, and companies focused heavily on retail partnerships, holiday marketing, and branding. By the late 1970s, the limitations of dedicated Pong-style systems were becoming clear. Consumers wanted more variety, more advanced gameplay, and systems that could grow over time. Even though first-generation consoles were technologically primitive, their impact was enormous. Between 1972 and 1977, they introduced the concept of home interactive entertainment and laid the groundwork for cartridge-based revolution that would define the second generation of gaming. The second generation of video game consoles began in the mid to late 1970s and is often referred to as the era that transformed gaming from a novelty into a growing entertainment industry. Unlike the first generation consoles, second generation systems introduced interchangeable game cartridges, allowing players to buy one console and continuously expand their game library over time. In 1976, the Fairchild Channel F became the first console to use programmable ROM cartridges. This was a major breakthrough because it solved one of the biggest limitations of first generation systems, which were restricted to built-in games. However, the most influential console of the generation arrived in 1977 with the release of the Atari 2600. Originally called the Atari Video Computer System, or VCS, developed by Atari, the Atari 2600 helped define what a home console could be. The Atari 2600 featured interchangeable cartridges, joystick controllers, and a much larger variety of games than earlier systems. Instead of only sports or Pong variations, players now had access to shooters, adventure games, racing titles, and arcade ports. This generation also saw major improvements in technology. Graphics became more colorful and recognizable, moving beyond simple dots and lines into actual characters, environments, and obstacles. Sound design also improved significantly, allowing games to include sound effects, music, and more engaging feedback. Popular games of the era included Space Invaders, which was ported to the Atari 2600 in 1980 and became one of the first killer apps for a home console, meaning it drove hardware sales. Other major titles included Adventure, one of the earliest action-adventure games, and Pitfall, released in 1982 by Activision. The second generation also marked the rise of third-party game development. In 1979, former Atari employees founded Activision after leaving the company over disputes about developer recognition and compensation. This made Activision the first major third-party video game developer, changing the business model of gaming permanently. As Atari dominated the market, more competitors entered the industry. Systems like the Mattel Intellivision, released in 1979, and the ColecoVision, released in 1982, offered stronger graphics and attempted to challenge Atari's market position. By the early 1980s, the video game industry was booming. Home consoles were becoming more mainstream, arcades were thriving, and gaming was becoming a recognizable part of pop culture. However, rapid growth also led to problems. As more companies rushed into the market, consoles and game libraries became oversaturated with low-quality software. This issue became especially visible with poorly received releases like E.T. the Extraterrestrial in 1982. These issues contributed to the video game crash of 1983, which caused major financial losses across the North American gaming industry. The third generation of video game consoles began in the mid-1980s and is often credited with reviving the home gaming industry after the video game crash in 1983. Following the crash, many consumers and retailers had lost confidence in video games, leaving the industry in need of a major reset. That reset came in 1983 as Nintendo released the Family Computer or Famicom in Japan. The system later launched in North America in 1985 as the Nintendo Entertainment System. The NES introduced stricter quality control through its licensing system and the Nintendo Seal of Quality, helping restore trust in home gaming. Because the term video game console had become associated with failure after the crash, Nintendo carefully marketed the NES as more than just a gaming device. In the United States, it was presented more like an entertainment toy, complete with accessories like the Rob or Robotic Operating Buddy and the Zapper Light Gun. This helped retailers feel more comfortable stocking the system in toy aisles rather than viewing it as another risky game console. Compared to previous generations, third-generation consoles featured major improvements in graphics, sound, and gameplay complexity. Games now had larger worlds, smoother movements, better music, and more recognizable characters. Popular titles from this era include Super Mario Bros. In 1985, which helped define the platforming genre, and The Legend of Zelda in 1986, which introduced players to larger, open-ended adventures with exploration and progression systems. While Nintendo dominated the generation, several other companies competed for market share. The Sega Master System, released by Sega in 1985, became Nintendo's biggest competitor in many international markets. Other notable consoles include the Atari 7800, released in 1986, the Atari XEGS in 1987, and the Commodore 64 game system in 1990. Although not all of these systems found major commercial success, they reflected the growing competition and experimentation happening in the recovering console market. Between 1983 and 1990, the third generation rebuilt the gaming industry and established many of the design standards, franchises, and business practice that still influence gaming today. The fourth generation of video game consoles began in the late 1980s and is often known as the 16-bit era, marking a major leap in graphics, sound quality, and processing power compared to previous systems. The generation officially began in 1987 with the release of the TurboGrafx 16 in Japan as a PC engine developed by NEC and Hudson Soft. Although technically powered by an 8-bit CPU, it was marketed as a 16-bit console and became an early competitor in the new generation. Nintendo entered the generation in 1990 with the release of the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, or SNES, in North America. Developed by Nintendo, the SNES built on the success of the NES while offering better graphics, improved sound capabilities, and more advanced gameplay. However, the biggest rivalry of the era came from Sega and its Sega Genesis, released in 1988 in Japan and 1989 in North America. This era is remembered for the beginning of the true console wars between Nintendo and Sega. Sega positioned itself as the edgier alternative to Nintendo, using aggressive marketing campaigns like Genesis does what Nintendo don't to appeal to older audiences.
You can't do this on Nintendo. Genesis does. Genesis does. Genesis does. Genesis does. Genesis does. What Nintendo?
To compete with Nintendo's mascot Mario, Sega introduced Sonic the Hedgehog in 1991, whose speed-focused gameplay and attitude helped define Sega's brand identity. Popular games from this generation included Super Mario World, The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, Street Fighter II, and Sonic the Hedgehog. Another notable console of the era included the Neo Geo, released by SNK in 1990, known for arcade-quality games and a very high price point. Between 1987 and 1996, the fourth generation pushed gaming further into mainstream entertainment, strengthened brand rivalries, and helped establish many iconic franchises and characters that remain relevant today. Chapter 6. The fifth generation of video game consoles began in the mid-1990s and is often remembered as a transition from 2D gaming into fully realized 3D graphics. This generation introduced polygonal visuals, analog controls, and CD-based media, dramatically changing how games looked and played. One of the biggest turning points of the era came from a failed partnership between Nintendo and Sony. In the late 1980s and the early 1990s, Sony had been working with Nintendo to create a CD-ROM add-on for the Super Nintendo, often referred to as the Nintendo PlayStation. The device was intended to combine Nintendo's cartridge-based hardware with Sony's CD technology, which would allow for larger games and improved audio capabilities. However, Disagreements over licensing rights and software revenue created tension between the two companies. Nintendo was reportedly concerned that Sony would gain too much control over CD-based software published on the platform. At the Consumer Electronics Show in 1991, Sony publicly announced its partnership with Nintendo and revealed plans for the hardware. But in one of the most famous moments in gaming history, Nintendo shocked the industry the following day by announcing a new partnership with Philips instead, effectively ending its agreement with Sony. The Philips deal ultimately went nowhere in terms of console success, but the fallout motivated Sony to continue independently in the gaming space. That decision led to the release of the PlayStation in 1994 in Japan and 1995 in North America. Sony's console used CDs instead of cartridges, allowing for larger games, better audio quality, pre-rendered cutscenes, and full motion video. Nintendo responded with the Nintendo 64 in 1996. While it remained cartridge-based for faster load times and stronger durability, this decision also limited storage capacity compared to CD-based competitors. The 5th generation also includes the Sega Saturn released in 1994 and the Atari Jaguar released in 1993. While Sony was quickly gaining momentum, longtime competitors were beginning to struggle. Sega Saturn suffered from a complicated hardware design that made it difficult for developers to program for effectively. Sega also hurt retailer relationships by unexpectedly launching the console early in North America in 1995, which created confusion and limited availability. Sega had already weakened consumer confidence with expensive hardware add-ons like the Sega CD and 32X, which fragmented its audience and made its hardware strategy seem unfocused. Atari also failed to regain its former dominance. Although the Atari Jaguar was marketed as the first 64-bit console, it struggled with poor developer support, a weak library of games, and difficult hardware architecture. By 1996, Atari merged with JTS Corporation, effectively ending its time as a major console manufacturer. This generation also changed how controllers were designed. Since games were now being played in 3D spaces, companies needed controllers that allowed for more precise movement. Nintendo introduced the analog stick with the Nintendo 64 controller, while Sony later released the DualShock, adding dual analog sticks and vibration. These controller changes helped players better navigate 3D worlds and became the foundation for modern controller design. This generation introduced many of gaming's most influential 3D titles. Super Mario 64 in 1996 helped establish the blueprint for 3D platformers by introducing analog movement, camera control, and open 3D level design. Meanwhile, Final Fantasy VII in 1997 became a major PlayStation success, showing how CD technology could support larger stories, cinematic cutscenes, and expansive worlds. Other major titles from the era included Metal Gear Solid, The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time, and Crash Bandicoot. Between 1993 and 2001, the 5th generation permanently changed gaming by bringing 3D graphics into the mainstream, popularizing CD-based gaming, establishing Sony as a major force in the industry, and signaling the decline of former hardware leaders like Atari and Sega. From simple dots and lines on the Magnavox Odyssey to fully explorable 3D worlds on the PlayStation and Nintendo 64, the first 5 generations of gaming laid the foundation for the industry we know today.